Character skills, like those in Duel Links and Hearthstone, are a great way to give decks or classes identities and serve a variety of important purposes. The first thing that they're able to do is provide room for diverse metas. Duel Links has certainly had its fair share of Tier 1 or even Tier 0 formats, and so has Hearthstone. But let's look at the early implementation of Rush as an example in the other direction. The game launched with just one box and a smattering of freely obtainable cards. With such a small card pool, you would normally only have flavors of the same good stuff pile as a viable option. But by introducing skills, they were able to create a metagame with over 10 decks. Some were better than others, and by a long shot. But by adding the restrictions to the cards you can or can't run, and introducing support for cards you would otherwise never consider, the game became much more interesting. Having a weaker deck, backed by a skill, draws in players that like to challenge themselves with underdog strategies, and also the experimenters that would otherwise find the game stale if every player was using the same deck. Less popular decks also gain dedicated fans based on aesthetic, and giving them the skills to compete will at least provide a small way to narrow the gap between it and a pile of whatever the best options are. Sometimes skills end up doing too many things at once, so let's transition to a simpler implementation of a skill system. Hearthstone has a series of classes with simple 2-mana abilities. With a large selection of neutral cards, players can look at the same pool and end up valuing different cards. Hunter, with an aggressive hero power, is much more likely to opt for a card like Boar or Bluegill Warrior than a value-oriented class like Priest, which would prefer to have a larger monster capable of winning trades before being healed up to fight again. This is further accentuated by the introduction of class-specific cards. Hunter gains even more value from Beasts, and the Knightly Order of Paladins get, Murlocs for some reason. Additionally, there are cards in Hearthstone which will buff and change your hero power, allowing a deck to get even a stronger class identity or mix things up later in the game after you've established no further need for that skill anymore. Let's go ahead and head back over to Duel Links and find that there is actually a really similar system in place. Many skills feature a restriction on monsters over 1400 attack, turning these low-level utility monsters into the game's equivalent to Hearthstone's neutral cards. Similarly, skills pull different monsters from this pool and make them significantly better, such as Piercing Samurai in decks that can change battle position, or Pyro monsters with the dedicated Noodle skill. Skills do a ton of good for creating variety and providing deck identities, but if they aren't managed properly, it can backfire. Much like with individual cards, there are some skills that are much stronger or weaker than others. When powerful skills combine with powerful cards, you end up with a format that only further reinforces a deck's capability to dominate, and it crowds out the rest of the game. But the biggest sin a skill can commit is resulting in a situation where a player performs the same patterns every game. Let's take an example of a few skills to talk about what I mean. First, we have Noodle Art Reboot, which allows a player to add back a paranormal monster anytime they summon a high-level monster. A free +1 is very powerful, but this skill is great. Pyro decks have 2 different bosses, and each rewards a different playstyle. The skill doesn't find the bosses for you, it doesn't dismantle the opponent's board, and it even works on a 1-beat monster if you want to run something more resilient to cards like Shield and Sword. The skill accentuates the game plan and makes cards that would otherwise probably not be very good into a competitive meta deck. Then, we have Magician's Shuffle, which allows players to consistently find Dark Magician from the deck and place it in the graveyard, or even add it to the hand. I think the skill is also great. Legend monsters are hard locked to one copy. Building a deck around them is going to feel awful if you don't have a way to consistently get it online. The skill allows support cards to really shine and do the job they could never do in a game without skills. The deck gives you access to your one key card, but there's still a lot more going on. The Dark Magician girls that are getting buffed by your Dark Magician probably aren't going to win the game on your own, and there is some management required to actually be able to get it onto the board and keep it there to use cards like Thousand Knives or Dark Magic Attack turn after turn. You're also going to need to get creative and figure out what the best cards to pair with the strategy are outside of the Dark Magician. Then we look at Eternal Bond, over from the speed duel side of the game, and this is much more problematic. To be clear, this deck is not the best deck in the game, nor is it even on the tier list, but the skill promotes doing the same thing over and over. You perform the same combos, you end on the same boss monsters, and it makes sure you always have exactly what you were trying to do. You simply hope that you are getting over the finish line with your skill, and whatever other cards happen to be in the opening hand. Card games are largely about the thrill of the draw, figuring out your best line of play, and making decisions. Skills that produce identical endboards game after game result in a lack of variety and scare away players. The Noodle skill supplements the gameplay. The Dark Magician skill makes sure you're able to do your basic game plan, but still requires you to do a lot of work. Skills like this just do everything. At the end of the day, skills should be thematic and fun. Your skills are going to vary in power level, but this also means weaker cards can get more powerful skills to put them on even ground with other decks. Finally, let's move on to how I am implementing skills in my own game. I've taken a mix between Hearthstone and Yu-Gi-Oh systems. Each player gets to choose a character, and that character comes with a variety of skills that can be used over the course of the game. For example, the Dragoon focuses on assisting tribute summons. The Valley Boost skill replaces the materials you use for that summon with fresh cards, allowing a snowball effect if the opponent isn't able to deal with your big monsters. But getting those monsters out takes time and resources, which is where the second effect, Unchain, comes in. By summoning your monsters without any tributes required, you're able to establish early board presence and win combat against weaker monsters before tributing off those monsters for your true bosses, which you then use the Rally Boost skill on to maintain resources, draw your buff spells, your debuffs, or even more monsters. On the other hand, we have the Necromancer, an undead-focused character with a focus on the discard pile. They have a secondary skill called the Weak to filter the hand while getting pieces in the graveyard, and several cards from their strategy focus on doing so as well. Then, once the graveyard is set up, the deck uses their payoff cards alongside their main skill to recur the lost units and overwhelm the opponent at the end of the game. So we have conditional skills that can be used every turn, and then we have something that can be used twice per game. Every character also has a third skill, which tends to focus on altering the terrain of the board. Yu-Gi-Oh players may be familiar with field spells, but my terrain is zone-based, allowing for a dynamic setup that changes over the course of the game. Old Yu-Gi-Oh players might remember the early manga chapters, or Duelist Kingdom, as potential inspirations for this setup. But that is a story for another time. If you made it to the end of the video, thank you so much for watching. If you're interested in hearing more about my design thoughts, check the playlist in the top left, where we've covered normal monsters, tribute monsters, and any videos that are coming out next. Or go ahead and click on the one below it to see where the algorithm takes you.